Good morning, friends. Are you ready to talk about some of the most incredible holy places in America? Because we have some beauties. I was actually going to make this a top 10 list, and then I just agonized over it, trying to narrow it down to only 10, when so many others were so close to being in that tippy top. Even narrowing it down to 25 was tough, and I had to make sacrifices that I did not want to make, including iconic religious buildings that would definitely make a list like this, and have in many other cases. So you might miss seeing some of your personal favorites, and you might be surprised by others, some of which you may not have heard of. But after much nail biting, I have come up with my top 25. Let's get started. Number 25 is St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. This Gothic Revival church is right in the heart of Manhattan, across from the Rockefeller Center, and I stop by every time I'm in New York. If you've ever been, you know how elegant and majestic this cathedral is, with its twin spires rising up above the city streets. It's an unforgettable church resting in the hustle and bustle of Manhattan. The last time I was there, I was with my parents, and my mother hadn't been inside a cathedral in years. They were actually doing a wedding rehearsal at the time, and my mom remarked on how amazing a cathedral wedding would be. And for the record, she really, really loved this church. The architecture is inspired by a mixture of English, German, and French Gothic. 45 of its 103 windows were actually manufactured in France. The church can hold thousands of people. There are 21 altars, 19 bells, each named for a different saint, more than 2,800 stained glass panels, and the gallery organ has 7,885 pipes. This is, without question, one of America's grandest churches. Number 24 is Wat Damaram in Kissimmee, Florida. You would never know that just outside of Orlando there is a huge Buddhist temple complex that looks like it's straight out of Thailand. When I heard about it, my sister and I did go to investigate, and she'd been living there for years and had no idea it was there. When we arrived, both of us were kind of floored. Most people limit their stay to just the main building, walk inside, maybe meditate for a few minutes, and then they're done. But I highly encourage you, if you visit, to wander around a little more. There are multiple shrines in this complex, each with unique features. My personal favorite is actually not in the main building at all, but further into the grounds. The interior motif is gold with accents in blue, green, and red. It's a very striking combination, and it's just dazzling. But there's also what I call the Red Tower, which includes several figures surrounding a central altarpiece, all filling the space of a tower room. The auditorium building also has a shrine that includes a series of Buddhas for every day of the week. And of course, I do love that the primary temple essentially has dragons guarding it. I'm not going to get into the difference between Nagas and dragons. I'm just saying more dragons in architecture, please. Number 23 is the Duke University Chapel in Durham, North Carolina. Right at the center of Duke campus, on the highest ridge of the west side of campus, is a stately Gothic church, and it's always been a favorite location of mine. Spending many of my growing years living in North Carolina, this was one of the first churches I was originally exposed to. It is built in the collegiate Gothic style with pointed arches and ribbed vaults. The entrance depicts 10 figures important to Methodism, Protestantism, and the American South, including Martin Luther and Thomas Jefferson. There was a statue of Robert E. Lee, but after it was vandalized in 2017, the university removed it, and the spot currently remains empty. The bell tower is modeled after the Canterbury Cathedral in Kent, England. The church boasts a 50-bell carillon as well as 3 pipe organs, one of which has over 5,000 pipes and another with nearly 7,000. There are 77 stained glass windows made up of over 1 million pieces of glass. One thing I always like about stained glass is how the light coming through will essentially paint the stonework interior various colors, depending on the time of day and the angle of the light. For music lovers, the interior of Duke Chapel has beautiful acoustics. I was lucky enough to be able to sing in this church when I was in high school. This alone makes it feel like a heavenly space. Number 22 is St. Edward's in Palm Beach, Florida. Named for St. Edward the Confessor, this is easily one of the most beautiful churches in Florida that I have yet found. The church is designed in the Spanish Renaissance style, and the effect is gorgeous. There are two simpler side altars, one dedicated to St. Anthony and the other to St. Teresa, but of course the main chapel is what gets the attention. Its stained glass windows, often called the Marian windows, depict scenes from the life of Mary, the Blessed Mother. These windows are vibrantly colored and the detail is exquisite. The windows are nearly a century old and part of the original church. They were imported from Munich, Germany. But what probably drew me most, maybe even more than the stained glass, was the high altar. This altar, called the Altar of the Sacred Heart, is made of Carrara marble and rests in a niche painted with a mural of the 12 apostles. The colors are understated but beautiful and allow for the white marble to stand out. The two altars as well flanking the main altar are quite pretty. From the ceiling, painting, and frescoes to the Last Supper on the base of the high altar, all the detail is outstanding and shows true craftsmanship. Number 21 is the Cathedral of the Madeleine in Salt Lake City, Utah. Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind when people think about religion in Utah is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and for sure the LDS Temple in Salt Lake is absolutely iconic and a definite must-see. But just a few blocks from Temple Square is the beautiful Cathedral of the Madeleine. This Roman Catholic cathedral is over a century old, built in 1909, utilizing Neo-Romanesque and Spanish Gothic styles, and is the only cathedral in the U.S. under the patronage of Mary Magdalene. It has been suggested that this is because the feast day of Mary Magdalene falls on July 22nd, which is 2 days before the LDS celebration of Pioneer Day on the 24th, and would give local Catholics something to celebrate that coincided with the state's dominant religion. Living in Utah for so long, I have visited the Cathedral of the Madeleine many, many times, even attending an organ concert there rather recently. So it's long been a personal favorite of mine, and is always a joyous surprise to those who are not expecting to see it. Number 20 is the Hindu Temple in Tampa, Florida. This was one of those unexpected surprises for me, a discovery I made when we were living in Florida. So on a stormy day, I ventured out to Tampa to see this one. Hindu temples dot the U.S. actually, and I visited a number of them. Sometimes I'm allowed to take photos, other times not. In this case, they were fine with me taking as many as I liked of the exterior, but I could not take anything inside. But the exterior was gorgeous enough to more than satisfy my need for religious beauty. Just walking around was a treat for the eyes. One thing I like about Hindu temples is that there are intricate carvings everywhere. This one had multiple towers, each one carved with a huge variety of figures and shapes. There were scenes and characters carved into the outer walls, and patterns featuring animals such as peacocks and elephants, two of my very favorite animals as it happens. I wish I could show you the inside because Hindu temples always have very colorful figures as part of their worship space, but as I try to respect those spaces always, I didn't even sneak anything. So trust me, the interior is lovely, but you'll have to check it out personally and see it for yourself. Number 19 is St. Mary's Assumption Church in New Orleans, Louisiana. I only got to spend a couple of hours in this city, and I only visited 2 churches. St. Mary's Assumption is the one that really grabbed me, though, and the one I had been looking forward to most. Built in 1860 by German immigrants, and in a German Baroque revival style, which is part of why I like it, it is part of the St. Alphonsus Parish. Ironically, the St. Alphonsus Church itself was closed and I wasn't able to view it, while St. Mary's Assumption did allow me to enter. I actually had this church entirely to myself, and it was quiet and peaceful and just so beautiful. The altar is especially exquisite. The colorful figures just really stood out to me. At the moment, the church is in desperate need of repairs due to extensive damage from rains and hurricane-related disasters. The interior has suffered water damage ever since Hurricane Katrina. Personally, I would love to see this church maintain its glory and continue to be preserved, so I've donated a small amount through patronage of this project in order to contribute to this cause. We definitely need to fight to keep all the beauty we possibly can in this world. Number 18 is Grace St. Luke's in Memphis, Tennessee. This church was a bit of a surprise. The only photo I'd ever seen of this Episcopal church was of a specific stained glass window which sits above the organ. It turns out there are several other superb stained glass windows in this church, including at least one Tiffany window. A trio of stained glass windows can be seen above the altar as well, which I find just as striking as the first window that drew me to the church to begin with. But then again, I can't get enough of stained glass windows. The church itself has a somewhat complex history dating back to before the Civil War, when Grace Church operated simply out of a rented room. As officers returned from the war, they started a new church, but when their congregations were nearly wiped out by yellow fever in 1878, they joined with Grace Church. St. Luke's, on the other hand, was built in 1894 but saw a decline in membership. By the late 1930s, Grace Church had a thriving congregation but no decent place to meet, while St. Luke's had a fairly new building but not enough parishioners to fill it. The two merged, celebrating their first combined service on Thanksgiving Day of 1940. Number 17 is the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. This was actually the very first cathedral I ever visited in my life. I was about 10 or so, and we went on a trip to DC as a family, and the National Cathedral was one of our stops. I remember being absolutely blown away by this incredible place, and I think it was at this point, though maybe not consciously, that I first set out on a course to discover beautiful churches. I have since been back to the cathedral a couple of times. It was also one of the earliest churches I ever photographed. The cathedral is actually dedicated to Saints Peter and Paul and is the 6th largest cathedral in the world and the 2nd largest in the U.S. after St. John the Divine in New York City. The cornerstone was laid by President Theodore Roosevelt. There are 112 gargoyles and over 1,000 grotesques, including one of Darth Vader, as well as 700 angels depicted on the exterior of the cathedral. Inside, there are 215 stained glass windows, and the rose window alone is comprised of over 10,500 pieces of glass. The high altar, which is truly a thing of beauty, is made from limestone taken from an ancient quarry outside Jerusalem, the same quarry where tradition says stones were taken for Solomon's temple. In front of the altar are 10 stones from Mount Sinai that symbolize the 10 Commandments, and beneath the oldest altar in the cathedral, in the Bethlehem Chapel, lies the cathedral's foundation stone, brought to America from fields in Bethlehem. The cathedral pays tribute to heroes of American history as well. A statue of George Washington sits in a niche. President Woodrow Wilson and Helen Keller are among more than 200 people interred in this cathedral, including musicians, artists, architects, engineers, and of course clergy. If you only ever see one great cathedral in the US, it probably ought to be this one. But we're not even halfway through the list, guys. Number 16 is the Basilica of the Sacred Heart in South Bend, Indiana. This is another university chapel, this one on the campus of Notre Dame, and I like this one even better than Duke Chapel. This is also a neo-Gothic church, but it looks very different from Duke. It's not nearly as large, but this one has more color to it for sure, and I'm particularly fond of the soft blue and gold motif. The murals were done by the Vatican painter Luigi Gregori, who was the artist in residence at Notre Dame for 17 years. The frescoes on the ceiling represent the night sky filled with stars, while the walls and transept are decorated with figures of saints. At the crossing of the nave and transept, the ceiling is gold instead of blue and features figures of the 4 evangelists and the Old Testament prophets: Isaiah holding a scroll, David with a harp, Jeremiah also with a scroll, and Moses with the tablet of the law, plus Matthew the angel, Mark the lion, Luke the ox, and John the eagle. There are various frescoes focusing on Mary as well, which is befitting of a chapel at Notre Dame, a phrase which means Our Lady. There are a total of 96 painted angels throughout the basilica. This basilica also has 3 altars, the high altar having been built in Paris and brought to Philadelphia, where it was then purchased for this church. There's really no end of beautiful details in this church, and I hope to return one day and see more of them. Number 15 is St. Stephen's in Cleveland, Ohio. When I first went to Ohio, a friend and colleague of mine had to tease me just a little bit by wondering why, of all places, Ohio would come up on my list of areas to see beautiful churches. But joke's on him, I saw some unbelievable churches, and 2 of them have actually made this list. The first one is St. Stephen's. This Gothic church is made entirely of stone, though the furnishing are almost all of wood. The church originally catered to German-speaking Catholics and was the 2nd church in Cleveland to do so. The main attraction here is definitely the high altar, which was masterfully crafted in oak by German woodcarvers. This is another example of the kind of altar I really enjoy seeing, with details and figures that almost bring the altar to life. Altars are such a specific element to a church that seeing uniquely beautiful ones will always draw me to a church, even if the rest of the interior isn't anything special. The St. Stephen's High Altar is a work of art and well worth visiting the church just on its own. The way the light moves through the sculpted figures is really quite something, and I think anyone can appreciate the skill it requires to create a piece like this, a skill that personally I would love to see more of in today's art and architecture. Just wait till you see the other Cleveland church, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Number 14 on my list is the Provo City Center Temple in Provo, Utah. This one is always such a tough one for me because I really do have two favorite temples in Utah, and of course the Salt Lake Temple is the other one. But as iconic as the Salt Lake Temple is, and as much as I have personal family ties to that temple as my parents were married there, the Provo City Center one still keeps insisting on dominance, even if just by the tiniest of margins. This temple was once the Provo Tabernacle, and I used to attend meetings there while I was a student at BYU. I was living in the area when the tabernacle was nearly destroyed in a fire in 2010. It sat as a kind of a shell of itself for a while, no one knowing what to do with it, and I remember the announcement during General Conference in October of 2011 that the tabernacle would be repurposed as a second temple for Provo residents, which really was much needed at the time. There was a ton of excitement following this announcement. It was a great way to restore and rebuild. They were able to keep the basic look of the tabernacle with a few alterations to make it a bit more temple-like, such as the central spire for the angel Moroni. The look of this temple is rather unique as well, largely because it was not originally a temple. That red brick makes for a very different aesthetic for a Latter-day Saint temple, which makes it stand out. It was finally opened in 2016, and it's been a personal favorite for me ever since. Number 13 is the Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church in Maitland, Florida. I actually have a couple of other videos featuring this church, including a brief walkthrough. The impact of this one is simply incredible. All the iconography is pretty much impossible to take in all at once. Every piece means something, though. Each scene is a story from the scriptures, and this idea harkens back to the days when most of the populace was illiterate, and the paintings and frescoes in a church were the way people could learn the Bible. As such, these are sometimes still referred to as writings rather than paintings in Orthodox religions, even though reading is no longer such an issue. Orthodox iconography has its own distinctive look, and it's fascinating to go through the various panels in the walls and ceilings to follow the biblical stories from one end to the other. One other feature of the Orthodox Church is the depiction of Christ looking down at the congregants from above. Look up at the ceiling the next time you visit an Eastern Orthodox church and see what you find. Number 12 is St. Mary's Church in Norwalk, Connecticut. St. Mary's was the first Catholic church in Norwalk, built in 1869, and it is absolutely beautiful. Another one with a gold and blue color scheme. This one has a very elegant light feel to it. A lot of Gothic revival tends towards darker tones, or at least will rely more or less on the natural color of the materials used. St. Mary's has undergone several redesigns since it first opened, with varying degrees of detail and ornamentation over the century and a half of its existence. In the 1990s, the entire church was painted over in a neutral whitish tone and was not nearly so ornamental. But only a few years ago, the church underwent yet another redesign and opted for a pale ethereal gold and lighter blue with a lot more detail and elaborate decoration. The effect is enchanting. The color is representative of Mary, who is typically depicted in blue robes to indicate both her purity and her status as nobility in heaven. Number 11 is Wat Kantayaram in Jacksonville, Florida. I got to spend a day in Jacksonville one weekend while living in Florida and actually visited two Buddhist temples. I loved both of them, but Wat Kantayaram was my favorite of the two. Buddhist temples are something I'm becoming more and more familiar with and more fond of. They tend to be colorful with lots of bright details, and of course they involve fantastical creatures. And every time I visit a Buddhist temple, I am treated so kindly. Most of the time, I am quickly and enthusiastically greeted by a Buddhist monk, and they almost always not only graciously lead me into the complex to enjoy it, but also offer to guide me through and personally show off their beautiful temple. And I really do like that. They take joy in their places of worship, and just as much joy in sharing it with others. Wat Kantayaram had some beautiful elements that I enjoyed. There are multiple smaller shrines surrounding the main temple, and I particularly liked the prayerful figures kneeling in humble hopefulness, as well as the winged golden figures above that appear to be holding up the roof of the temple. And the spire of the temple is also gilded. I'm used to seeing a gilded angel Moroni on the spires of LDS temples, but a whole entire spire of gold? It was pretty eye-catching. Number 10 is the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. Try saying that 3 times fast. Most people will probably know about the National Cathedral, but far fewer are likely to be familiar with the National Shrine. This church is, in a word, spectacular. Designed in a mixture of Byzantine and Romanesque styles, there's a reason that this is even higher on the list for me than the National Cathedral, despite that church's personal significance to me and the fact that it's so iconic. The National Shrine is even grander, both in scale and design. It is absolutely massive. Built by Catholics and often called America's Catholic Church, this church honors the Blessed Virgin Mary, the patron saint of America. Side note, can I just say how cool it is that of all the patron saints, America gets none other than the Mother of Christ? Just take a second. That's cool. The Basilica, with its 80 chapels and oratories, honors Mary through a multitude of cultural elements. The entire church is designed to reflect the melting pot of cultures America has always prided herself on, and each chapel is entirely unique, representing a huge variety of nationalities, ethnicities, and cultures. African, Austrian, Chinese, Cuban, Czech, Filipino, French, German, Guamanian, Hungarian, Indian, Irish, Italian, Korean, Latin American, Lebanese, Lithuanian, Maltese, Polish, Slavic, Slovenian, and Vietnamese. And across all of these cultures is the general theme of the Virgin Mary. As such, there are at least dozens, I admit I haven't counted, of depictions of the Madonna and Child, a type of religious art specifically showcasing the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus. From the entrance into the shrine to the chapels both in the upper chapel as well as the lower chapel and crypt, this theme repeats in every style imaginable. The variety is astounding, and every chapel is honestly very pretty in its own way, though of course I do have my personal favorites. Number 9 is St. Joseph in Macon, Georgia. St. Joseph is a very stately church, classic in its architecture with the tallest twin towers in Macon. The interior features 60 stained glass windows which teach the story of salvation. The white marble altar and the pulpit are also classic. The tones of the interior are warm and let in good natural light, and the entire church in general is beautiful. It seems like a simple church overall, but when you look a little closer, the details start to emerge. The depiction of Christ on the cross, flanked by Mary Magdalene and the Virgin Mary, carved in relief in the center of the altarpiece. The soft blues in the panels in the ceiling, particularly in the aisles, guiding the visitor to the center and front of the church. The beautiful stained glass. And then there's my personal favorite feature of this church, the side altars. One in red, the other in blue. In this instance, I would say the side chapel altars are even more beautiful and memorable than the high altar. The one on the right, in blue and gold, is the Mary Chapel with a statue of Mary and the baby Jesus, a Madonna and Child, flanked on both sides by angels to adore the newly born Prince of Peace. The chapel on the left, in red and gold, depicts the adult Christ, with angels bowing now to worship him as Savior. The detail work in these mosaics with golden sun rays and vibrant colors highlighting the marble statues is just so beautifully done. These chapels are the most photographed aspect of the church for good reason. They're pretty incredible. Number 8 is St. Sophia in Los Angeles, California. I have one word for this place: gold. This entire church is just covered in gold and gilded details. St. Sophia is a Greek Orthodox church, the first Orthodox church I visited after I officially began this project. I arrived right as the church was about to open, and the woman who was preparing to open it, when she heard what I was doing and why, she had one of my favorite ever responses. She asked me to close my eyes, went into the main chapel to turn on the lights, carefully guided me in, and gleefully told me to open my eyes. I honestly wish someone had had a video camera on me at the time, because I'm pretty sure my reaction was hilarious. I really don't know quite how much that church would blow me away. I mean, I really didn't anticipate that, but I actually couldn't breathe for a second. The cathedral itself is actually the result of a Hollywood success story. Charles Skouras and his brothers were attempting to make a name for themselves in Hollywood, and Charles made a vow to God that if he would grant them the success they sought, he would build the most majestic cathedral in gratitude. God granted that desire, so he fulfilled his promise, and the church was built in 1952. So, something good coming out of Hollywood for a change. While the exterior is pretty simple, obviously the interior is anything but. The chapel is full of light from the windows to the chandeliers, which mirrors the Orthodox teaching that the inside of a human being should be light. Look beyond the gold and even the crystal chandeliers, and you will find some very rich colors, which, as I've said before, is very common in Orthodox churches. But the gold shining in that light of the church is what will dazzle the eyes. Number 7 is St. Lucy's in Newark, New Jersey. This church is... honestly, I'm not sure I can adequately describe it. This church kind of has everything. Beautiful stained glass, incredible statuary that is easily some of the best I've seen in a church to date, columns with subtle details, and the most glorious thing for me, a painted ceiling that almost forces you to look up at it. I've always loved beautiful ceilings, especially in a church. I have made practically a motto out of the phrase, always look up. You have to look up. Sometimes the best part of the church is above you. Beautiful ceilings are especially appropriate in a church. The idea of a church is to help you rise above and reach towards heaven, towards a higher life. What better way to encourage us than simply having us look up? We're looking up to heaven. We're looking up to God. So the first thing I do whenever I enter a church is look up and see what's there. St. Lucy's absolutely does not disappoint. I think I stared at that ceiling for a good 5 minutes without moving. It was a while before I even got to the rest of the church. But I finally did, and the rest of it was just as pretty. Obviously, I love the stained glass, that's a given, but I really loved the statues in this church. On both sides of the transept are rows of statues depicting saints. They're subtly colored and are reminiscent of classic sculpture. They're bathed in soft light, so they're noticeable, but don't take anything away from the rest of the church's features. As far as ornate churches go, St. Lucy's is a definite favorite. Number 6 is St. John the Baptist in Savannah, Georgia. I've actually been to this cathedral 3 times now. It is absolutely one of my favorite churches in the U.S. And this just isn't just on my own list either. St. John the Baptist is frequently named one of the top cathedrals to visit in the U.S., and with very good reason. Known colloquially as the Sistine of the South due to its many painted details throughout, it's actually a French Gothic-inspired design, and it's beautiful both inside and out. The church dominates Liberty Square, the spires rising above you, and it draws you to it. When you enter, it is astonishing. The pointed arches throughout and the classic vaulting, creating a breathtaking space that feels like it's lifting you up. The yellow, pink, and blue pastel coloring is a soft look but has lots of character. There are details and patterns everywhere you look, and of course some stunning stained glass windows, more than 70 in all. The large transept windows are my favorites in this church, the south window depicting the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin and the north window the Ascension of Christ. This is one of those churches that seems to have something everywhere you look, and it's a little hard to take it all in at first. The high altar is surrounded by murals of the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is pretty typical of Roman Catholic cathedrals. The altar is of white marble, carved in Italy, and weighs over 9,000 pounds. Etched into the marble is the inscription, "Blessed are they who are called to the banquet of the Lamb," written in Latin. This is a quote from the book of Revelation, which happens to be my favorite book of the Bible. The murals that adorn this cathedral were created in New York, not to be confused with frescoes, where the paint is actually applied to the wet plaster itself. The use of murals in this church involved paintings in oil on canvas, which were then transferred to the cathedral walls. In the year 2000, a baptistry was added, made of marble and weighing nearly as much as the high altar at over 8,000 pounds. At the time, a hurricane necessitated a call for a citywide evacuation. However, the workers stayed through the night, riding out the hurricane to get the baptistry installed. Easy to see why this is one of my all-time favorite churches in America. All right, we've made it to our top 5. Number 5 is St. Michael the Archangel in Cleveland, Ohio. Finally, we get to the second Cleveland church on my list. Completed in 1892, this church is the tallest in Cleveland. It is also, in my opinion, the most stunningly beautiful. An example of high Victorian Gothic architecture, the church currently serves a large Latin American community and performs masses in both English and Spanish. The church is largely made of local stone. The 2 towers are of unequal height and combined contain 4 tons of bells, and the triple arches at the entrance feature a pair of archangels above the central portal. But once again, we come to a church that is, in fact, more glorious on the inside than on the outside. The overwhelming religious iconography is enough to take anyone's breath away for a moment or two. The nave, as well as the aisles, are groin vaulted, and the columns are thin and clustered with floral capitals at the top. It is a very colorful church with lots of patterned details to see. The church features more than 50 colorful statues, a great many of which are part of the massive high altar, which is my favorite element of this church. It is a highly ornate wooden altar, and you could probably spend an hour just going through this thing and finding all the details. The altar was largely imported from Germany and is modeled after the altar of the Church of St. Francis in Borgo, Italy. It's one of the single most beautiful things I've ever seen. Definitely unexpected to find this in Cleveland of all places, but it lands a place among my favorite churches. Number 4 is St. Anthony of Padua in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Possibly the first thing you will notice when you enter this church is all the angels. The interior of this church is absolutely filled to bursting with angels. They line the nave above the columns, they adorn the corners, they're even featured in the altarpiece itself. Angels are kind of the theme of this church. It is officially a Romanesque design, but many of the details are more reminiscent of what you might find in a Baroque or Rococo church, which is probably why I like it so much. The angels were created by an Italian sculptor named John Castagnoli. He carved 32 of them, some of which are over 20 feet tall. The faces of the angels were modeled after the faces of some of the church's parishioners. When I visited this church, I arrived at a time they were technically closed, but one of the women in the rectory was kind enough to allow me into the church for a little while anyway. So I got this place entirely to myself for about a half an hour. I was greeted to this vast pink interior, surrounded by angelic figures, light coming in through all the windows, so there was no need for artificial light, and I just sat in a pew for a few minutes and drank it all in. Number 3 is St. Hedwig Church in Trenton, New Jersey. There is shockingly little information to be found about this church, and it's hard to find people who have even heard of it. And yet, here's this incredible Roman Catholic church that's almost smack dab in the middle between Philadelphia and New York. I've never seen it on a list of most beautiful churches in the country or even the state, which is just ridiculous to me. How do you manage to hide a church this pretty? I honestly don't get it. So I can't really go much into the history or significance of this church, as I simply don't know much about it. It was built to serve a rising Polish Catholic community. This is another church with a pink color theme, but the apse is done largely in blue with painted figures surrounding the altar. The figures seem more reminiscent of the iconography of an Eastern Orthodox church, even stylistically, and the effect is unique. The altar itself contains several colorful figures and is actually lit from within to showcase the crucifixion. It's a breathtaking and completely unexpected church, so unexpected that no one seems to even know it's there at all. But now you know it's there, and I highly encourage you to check it out if you're in the Trenton area. Number 2 is the Sri Swaminarayan Hindu Mandir in Robbinsville, New Jersey. So yes, we get another one from New Jersey that makes 3 in the top 10 from this state. They clearly have some hidden gems in New Jersey. This Hindu temple is one of only 6 of its type in North America. Los Angeles, Chicago, Atlanta, Houston, and Toronto, Canada make up the other 5. I had previously visited the one in the Atlanta area, and it's probably just as gorgeous, though they would not allow me to take any photos inside, and that was the best stuff. If you get the chance, though, any of these temples is a treat. I got to the one in Robbinsville at night. I wasn't even sure they'd be open and was prepared to wait until the morning to attend, but sure enough, it was not only open, but bustling. They were engaged in some sort of event. I never did find out what it was, but there was a lot of energy and excitement in everyone there. As I mentioned before, one of the things I really do love about Hindu temples is all the carvings, and this place is carved to the hilt. It's also sort of a temple within a temple. The main building, which features carvings and details both inside and out, actually houses the main temple inside it. So it's layers of temples, the one housing the other like nesting dolls. I believe they were working on a second building when I was there, and I don't know how that's coming along at this point, but I hope to check out this place again one day, so maybe that will be done. When I entered the inner temple, so to speak, I was in awe of the sheer level of detail in all the carvings, the columns, the walls, even the ceiling, which was incredible. Remember when I said always look up? Yeah, that evidently applies to Hindu temples too. But as I stood there, staring up at the ceiling, all of a sudden, people inside started to sing. a chant-like melody that absolutely filled this carved marble space. Oh my gosh, it was powerful. One of the most amazing musical experiences that I've ever had in my life. I can't even describe it. I've been in cathedrals that didn't have this kind of power in the music. It was absolutely heavenly. I think it was this place more than any other that got me completely hooked on Hindu temples. That kind of experience just sticks with you. But the sheer beauty of this place is hard to beat. There really are a lot of beautiful places in this country, and I've been blessed to see so many. There are, of course, many that I loved that didn't quite make the cut, so before I give you my absolute top pick, just a few quick honorable mentions. St. Andrew's in Roanoke, Virginia is a small church in high Victorian Gothic style. The interior is airy and open, but if you'll notice, the church does not actually have columns. It has the illusion of columns with beams suspended from the ceiling, but there are no floor-to-ceiling columns supporting the interior, making it more open. The church was once painted in white and gold and shifted later to a warmer, richer tone accented with blue. A stunning little church and well worth the visit. The Basilica of the Assumption in Baltimore was the first Roman Catholic cathedral in America, as well as being a minor basilica and a national shrine. It was the masterpiece of Benjamin Henry Latrobe, known as the father of American architecture, who also designed the nation's Capitol building. This neoclassical building, completed over 200 years ago, has a dome and was designed more or less to evoke the imagery of places like the Pantheon in Rome, a break from the English Gothic most common to the time. St. Peter's Church in Memphis, Tennessee is a little-known church, and it's just lovely. Not as openly grand as many that I've seen and shared here, but sweet and classic. I was allowed up into the loft to see this church from a higher perspective, but any way you look at it, it's a very pretty little church and worth a quick visit. And I really can't talk about my favorite holy places in the U.S. without paying due respect to the LDS Temple in Salt Lake City. I can't get through a top 25 video without at least mentioning it, guys. Provo City Center may have edged it out by the narrowest of margins on my favorites list, but this temple is so iconic that it draws millions of people from all over the world, regardless of their religion. The stories of the saints who built it through painstaking labor and sacrifice are legendary, the spires are instantly recognizable, and it's widely considered the mothership of all Latter-day Saint temples throughout the world. This temple is magnificent and rightly tops most people's list of most beautiful religious buildings in America. We're about to get to number 1, and I'll just quickly remind you that we'd love your help in supporting this channel so we can keep finding and sharing new holy places. Click that subscribe button, hit the bell, and don't forget to like the video, share it, and leave us a comment telling us which one is your favorite. All right, drum roll please. My top favorite holy place in the U.S. is the Palace of Gold in Moundsville, West Virginia. Let me guess, you've never heard of it. If you haven't, you would hardly be alone. This is one of those places that manages to fall through the cracks. To be fair, it is in the middle of nowhere. It took my GPS 4 tries to even find it. You have to go up and down dirt roads that turn to mud, and Moundsville itself is not exactly a bustling metropolis, but this Hare Krishna complex is unbelievable. The word palace might seem misleading, but this is actually a large temple complex with multiple buildings, and more than a few being planned or in the works. The palace is only a part of it. The black and gold palace sits at the top of the hill. The exterior is pretty spectacular, a very unique look with the black structure accented by shining gold patterns. You'll find a consistent motif of elephants as well as peacocks, a bird that is beloved by the Hare Krishnas. In fact, you'll often find live peacocks of the grounds on the grounds of their temples. The entirety of this building was created by the Hare Krishna people themselves, a real labor of love. They learned how to design, build, and even taught themselves how to make stained glass. And you will find a lot of it on the inside of the palace. The interior is, once again, even more grandiose than the exterior, if you can believe it. And there are colors everywhere. Colored tiles, colored glass chandeliers, and that peacock motif crops up inside as well with stained glass peacocks throughout, which in turn paints the floors and walls a fantastic array of colors. The inner sanctuary has more muted tones, but the details are beautiful. There's gold at the tops of the columns, and of course, you gotta look up at that ceiling. You can take a tour of the palace for a few dollars, but don't stop there. Just down the hill, there is the new Vrindavan temple. While the palace is where they learn, the temple is where they worship. The Hare Krishna differ from the Hindu faith they stem from in that they only believe in one god versus many. Krishna is only one among various gods in Hinduism, but is the one and only deity capable of taking various forms in the Hare Krishna tradition. More on that in a minute. He is also the speaker of the Bhagavad Gita, a book recognized throughout the world as containing great wisdom. The new Vrindavan temple is named after the holy land in India of Vrindavan, where Krishna is believed to have lived over 5,000 years ago. At the doors of the temple, you can see two giant blue figures, each a representation of Krishna himself. The blue color is striking and the scale of the figures is huge. Walk through the doors and you will enter a room filled with numerous altars, each covered in gold in keeping with the theme of the complex. When I first arrived, the figures on the altar were hidden behind silk curtains, but I was urged to stay for a little while so that I could see them unveiled, and I was very glad I did so. The full effect of the altars was impressive. The figures were highly colorful, decked out in blue and yellow. The figures at Hare Krishna and Hindu temples have different outfits that are changed out every day by faithful practitioners given the job of dressing the gods. It's actually quite an honor. This was why the altars were temporarily behind screens when I first arrived, as privacy is considered essential as part of this practice. It is treated with utmost respect. So the color scheme changes, sometimes daily. If you visit, you may get a completely different look than I have here. At the end of the day, they're also dressed in their own PJs. Each altar's figures are different, but all depict Krishna in some way. Krishna can be seen as a blue four-armed figure, as you see at the entrance to the temple. He also sometimes appears as a half-man, half-lion, an incarnation sent to end religious persecution and calamity on earth. The most common depiction, however, is Krishna playing a flute and accompanied by Radharani, the manifestation of the divine feminine forever at the side of Krishna. According to the Hare Krishna, the highest truth has both male and female aspects. Like the sun and the sunshine, each gives meaning to the other. I still have a lot more places to start planning visits to in the US, and there are likely to be holy places that replace some of those on this list. But as of right now, these are my top 25 holy places in America. So if you're ever in the vicinity of any of them, I highly recommend stopping by. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.